Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning. I hope you are all well. Welcome to Policy Masterclass 2. So the reason why we call it 2, we had the first Policy Masterclass around 3 months ago. And based on those discussions, we thought to hold this second version. And the topic of today is understanding the public policy process on a legal perspective. So on behalf of Yeba Impact and Beneath the Impact, we thank you for having time to join us today. And under Beneath the Impact, we usually have masterclass series from beginning of this year, which is designed to bridge the gap between policy and practice and bringing experienced practitioners and change makers to share practical lessons that help change makers to create a greater impact. You can get recordings of our previous masterclasses on our YouTube channel, and we'll be happy to share that link after this session together with recording and presentation. So today we explore a topic that sits at the heart of sustainable change, the public policy process. Many impactful ideas never achieve their full potential because they fail to navigate the policy and legal systems that shape our decisions. Understanding how policy is developed, how laws are made, and how evidence influences the decision-making process is crucial for researchers, civil society organizations, businesses, development practitioners, and public leaders. We are privileged today to be joined by Kiragu Wachira, one of the Kenya leading public policy and legislative experts. With over 18 years of experience advising governments and development partners, drafting over 17 policy instruments and 40 bills, Kiragu brings a wealth of practical experience in translating evidence into policy and action. Today's session, he will walk us through the public policy process from a legal perspective, sharing practical insights, real-world experience, and lessons on how individuals, organizations can effectively engage and influence policy. So the webinar series will start with that masterclass, then we'll have a Q&A session after he has completed. However, we usually advise and recommend also to drop the questions through the chats or even reflections on the chat that we can also cover at the Q&A session. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome Kiragu. Over to you, Kiragu.
Thank you very much, Dennis. Kindly just confirm that you can see my screen.
Yes, I can, and I can hear you well.
Okay.
Over to you.
Thank you so much. So I appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation. So we're going to look at understanding public policy process. As you're aware, it's just, we have few minutes, maybe about less than 30, for me to run through the presentation. And then we'll have a session for questions and answers. So what we're going to look at today is just briefly, how do we build a understanding of the policy process? But to start with that, we need to understand what are the different few concepts and definitions. What are we, when we say public policy or policy, what do we mean by that? Then we're going to look at public policy instruments and institutions that make policies. We're going to look at them in terms of international, regional, and national. This is just more of a highlight so that we're able to understand when we are looking at policy process, which institutions are dealing with that and how do we go about it. Then I will narrow down into the specific process issues. How do we move from conceptualization or ideation all the way to formulation? What's the process of formulating sessional papers, legislative instruments? And then we'll end at a reflection briefly on how do we reform policies. So the structure of today's masterclass is just to give us a basic understanding. I know some of us have deeper knowledge and experience. Others, perhaps some of the concepts will be new in terms of introduction. So let's look briefly at definition and concepts. So when we talk about public policy, we're looking at a few things. One, we're looking at interrelated decisions taken by a political actor. So there are decisions that are taken by political actors, whether they are parliamentarians or senior executive officials, ministers, presidents, and they are focusing mainly on selecting goals. So when you look at a policy maker, the decisions they are making in regard to one particular issue, the power play, the direction they're taking, all that, then that tells you that that is a policy that they are following through. Then it's also dealing with a political agreement on the course of action. So you have different problems that government is solving or political actors are solving. So the agreement on that course of action is taken as policy. So what we mean by this is, let's say, for example, we have an election. So how do we conduct an election? So when political actors agree that this is the course of action, this is how we conduct our elections. So for example, you must carry your identity card. That is already a policy because it's a political agreement by the actors. But also in action is also policy. So when government fails to take action on a particular area, it is also deemed to be the policy. So if, for example, the government is not keen on taking handling crime, then you can assume that inaction in handling crime can be deemed to be the policy that the government is pursuing. And that helps you that policy does not necessarily have to be written. So certain actions can be interpreted to be policy. It's also a course of action taken by government, executive, legislature on a particular issue. So we are looking at what problem are we dealing with, what issue we are dealing with, and what is the course of action. So that again is deemed to be policy. And lastly, it's a purposeful direction and a pattern of action. So here we're looking at a purpose, so that it's an intentional direction that a government official, an institution that is taken in dealing with a particular public problem or a matter of concern over time. So when you look at the pattern that government has taken, whether through instruments or through action or through behavior, so long as they're dealing with a particular problem, that then is deemed to be a policy. Then public policies exist in diverse policy fields or sectors. So when you look at policy, there is no one policy for the whole country. It depends on sectors. So you have policies in education sector, in health, economy, law, justice, trade, commerce. So as many issues that we have in a society, then we also have policies existing in those policy fields. So we wouldn't have like one policy. It's purely based on which are the specific area that we are looking at. But remember that you need government actions to do few things that are critical in policies. One, you need government actions to regulate behavior, to regulate actions, whether it's in the market, like regulating trading. You need to regulate how people drive, regulate how people consume certain products or should not consume certain products. You need government to control. So you're controlling crime, you're controlling alcohol use, you're controlling use of drugs. You need government actions to promote, like you're promoting education, you're promoting business, you're promoting gender equity. You also need government actions to develop certain things, maybe develop infrastructure, develop aviation, develop education systems in every policy field. And then lastly, in terms of the concepts, which is very critical for us to look at, is that when you're looking at the term policy, you're describing activities, one in two critical areas. One could be policy in a policy field or policy in a policy subfield. It's like the way you have a sector and a subsector. So we first start with the main thematic area. So we can talk about Kenya's economic policy. So that is wide. But now under economic policy, you also have sub-policies. That's what we call policy subfield. So you have policy sub-thematic areas like monetary policy or fiscal policy. So ordinarily, there's more than one subfield in a policy field. So when you look at economic policy, you can dissect it to two major areas. But even when you go to monetary policy, you still look at critical areas like exchange currency or the money system or banking policy. So when you're looking at a field or a subfield, don't just look at one thematic area. You still narrow down. And so it helps us to see when you're doing a policy advocacy, You have to start at the policy field. What is the country's economic policy? Then you go narrow it down. Each and every area, you may even find different laws governing the specific policy field, maybe a law governing a subfield. So that helps us to see what are we tackling. Whenever I'm working on a policy or a law, I normally start with asking myself, what this law or this problem we're dealing with, it fits within which policy field. That helps me see if it's an education policy, what are the critical aspects it has the country taken as a direction in terms of education policy. So that helped me shape my subfield in regard to what I'm looking at. Perhaps I could be looking at university education policy or basic education policy. So that's the reason and the value for that. So when we are looking at policy process, we have to appreciate that policy is found in instruments. So since policies are measures taken by government, we have to look at what are the instruments that the government is pursuing or using to pursue a particular policy. So we can't look at policy process without understanding. So which policy are we going to look at? Because they all have different directions and different spaces for engagement. So one critical area for policy instruments, meaning the tools that the government uses to regulate, to promote, to develop, or control an area. So we have the Constitution, Act of Parliament, or County Assembly, statutory instruments like regulations, rules, orders, technical guidelines. So this first field of law is where we have the normative areas where you require enforcement, legal liabilities, and legal expectation and obligations. So that's the first instrument, laws that we have. So that's where you find policy. If you're talking about education policy, which laws are there to guide the policy? Then there are sessional papers. So they're called sessional papers because they are introduced in Parliament during the particular session. So that's why they're called sessional papers. So these are policies that are high and overarching, and they provide policy directives with administrative and legal implications. So education policy, industrialization policy, policy on Vision 2030, industrial policy. So all that, those are called session papers. So what happens is that they cover policy field and not mainly subfields. By and large, they cover a whole field. And even if they're covering a subfield, mostly it's a subfield that has a lot of weight. So why this is important is because ideally before you come to laws, you should develop a sessional paper. So here is you do your research and then you have a normative way of directing as a country. What should we be doing in terms of industrialization? So you have a sessional paper. If it doesn't go to Parliament for adoption, it then does not become a sessional paper. And the advantage of a sessional paper is that once it is adopted by a Parliament, it has a force of administration, and the government can then implement and budget its process. Then we have master plans or development plans. These are also policies, but then they come after, for example, sessional papers. Some could be legislated or provided for under the laws. So these are long-term planning technical documents. They look at the future, long-term growth and development planning, and they are anchored in various legislations. So for example, the Kenyan National Spatial Plan, the 2015 to 2045, is a national spatial plan, but it's a master plan. And it's policy, because once it's the given direction that this is how we plan our space, geographical space, that becomes the policy. When you have our development plans, like the county integrated development plans, that is policy already. But remember that is not a sessional paper and it's not a law, but it is a master plan. Again, that is a space for policy. Then we have policy instruments, further instruments of public finance, for example, budgets, or county fiscal strategy paper or the national fiscal strategy paper. So those are policy documents, but mainly finance related. So a budget, though it appears finally in a legal document called an Act of Parliament, but it is an instrument of public finance. So again, that is a whole space of policy. The fiscal strategy papers or budget outlook papers, they are policy documents because they guide and they direct how the country is shaped. So then we have operations policies, for example, plans for a strategic nature, like strategic plans, plans for the day-to-day operations. So you see government, how it works. So you have, let's say, Procurement Act. But internally, there are procurement procedures. Ministries have strategic plans. So those plans are still policy, because that's how they budget. They budget based on those plans. The annual development plan Part of it is operational because it's guiding the day-to-day operations. Then we have executive orders issued by the president. So you hear of executive order number 2 of 2026. So the structure of government, for example, it's a policy. How ministries are structured they are mainly based on the executive directive by the presidential order. So that is policy because that is then how the country is taken. Then lastly, we have circulars and of an administrative nature. So you find that they instruct public officers and ministries and departments on how government procedures are operating. And in government, circulars are very important. So circulars from cabinet, circulars from treasury, salaries and remuneration commission, circulars from different regulatory bodies. So these circulars, they have policy, they are policy in nature, but they are administrative. And they give force because if you breach the circulars, then you'll be contradicting the public service, for example, expectations. So those are the different aspects about the policy instruments. So when you're looking at policy process, you need to understand what exactly is the specific nature of the policy that we are looking at. So briefly, again, looking at the policy institutions, then besides looking at the instruments, you have to understand what are the policy institutions, because these are the ones that then define the problems, they initiate the process, they formulate the policies, they adopt the policies and implement those policies. So they are either at the international level, regional level, national, or county. So each of these levels has its own specific policy mandate, policy space, and policy direction that they take. For international institutions, so what we just need to appreciate is that they are established to govern global policy issues. And what happens is that the decisions are made by consensus. Sometimes they do the voting. Countries are required to ratify if it's the legal instruments. The policy instruments could either be resolutions, directives, advisory notes, commentaries, or treaties. Now, why this is important for us is that under Article 3 of the Kenyan Constitution, the international treaties that Kenya has ratified becomes part of the Kenyan law. And when the international instruments are adopted at the global level, they impact on us. So when you're looking at policy, we then have to understand that the global policy space influences what we do, and therefore the process of how they make the policies is also relevant to us. And if you look at the institutions I've just given as an example, they all cover a particular area, whether it's health, development, AIDS, environment, children and education, trade. So all that, the policy spaces that we're looking at, the policy fields that we're looking at, they all are anchored around a particular UN agency or a global agency. And that is, again, part of the influence of what we have in policy. So for regional policy institutions, so we are looking at institutions that are established at continental level. For example, for us, we have the African Union, EAC, COMESA, SADC for the southern region. So regional bodies are also very important because they create policy that governs the countries. So AU, for example, is it's a alone inclusive entity. But EAC and COMESA, they are partly mainly trade. They're trade related, but of course, like EAC, it's moving towards not just trade, but economic integration, and also they're looking at political integration. But for now, by and large, they're trade related. So you may have regional bodies that are sector specific, or policy field specific, or like African Union that is all inclusive, or SADC that they govern the wide spectrum of the national building. Then at national level, again, we come to our two major spaces. We have the national and county. For other countries, for example, you find they have federal government, they have states, they have provinces, they have regions. So when you're looking at policy, then you ask yourself, what is it that is a national level of policy? What is it that is a subnational level policy? Within our context, you find our parliament, both Senate and National Assembly, is a policy-making organ. The executive, the ministries, departments, agencies, the judiciary. So at national level, you find judicial pronouncements. The act and decisions are actually policy decisions that shape how we interact and how we make decisions. At county level, we have the assembly and the executive. Again, that's the space around the policy. But the function assignment under the fourth schedule in our constitution is what decides which policy space you're looking at national and county. But also you find in other countries, whether you go to America or US or Canada, whichever country, there is always a policy field and space that is only assigned to national government. And there are certain policy fields that are assigned to subnational or federal or regional or states. And that is important because then you need to have certain level of harmony. So whenever you're looking at a policy, the first point of call is this problem supposed to be solved at national level or subnational level? Then if it's a subnational level, does it require legislative intervention or executive intervention? So again, that's the reason for looking at the institutions. Let's look at the other critical part about the policy process. So when you're looking at the policy process or the cycle, we are looking at first setting the agenda. So you have to think through before taking an action in policy. We have to set the agenda. We have to then formulate the policies. We implement those policies and we evaluate. For today, we'll focus more on setting the agenda and policy formulation because that's the most critical part when we are looking at the policy design. So agenda setting, what does that mean? It means identifying the problems and defining those problems and deciding that we need to take action on those particular problems. So what agenda setting means is when you're looking at identifying the problems, one is that you have to appreciate that defining the problem is most critical part of policy making. What problem are we dealing with? Is that children are not going to school, or children are not affording the school, or schools are not available, or schools are available but they're not accessible? So you have to define the problem. Now, problem definition mainly follows a causal relationship. You have to look at the problem. What are the causes? So what is causing children not to go to school? Is it at the uniform? Is it there are no schools? There are no teachers? So then assign the blame to those causes. So you have to assign a blame. So I have a problem of children are not going to school. So what are we blaming that to? Then the claims that the government is responsible for stopping the problem. So you have to assign, yes, kids are not going to school, but you have to assign that government needs to take action. If it is not, it does not require government to take action, then there is no policy. So therefore, not every problem in society requires government intervention because you have to assign a claim that by the way, only government can solve it. So, and that's how we define the problem. So this is where we make a miss sometimes because we define the problem wrongly. We rush into defining the problem. So we have wrong interventions. So in terms of the setting the agenda, so you have a whole list of subjects or problems to which the government officials or political leaders are looking at, or even people outside government. They are looking at a particular problem. They're paying serious attention to any given problem. Like now, goonism in political process is becoming a problem. So that is something that requires an agenda setting. We are talking about it. It's one of the problems. Femicide in the country is a problem, or corruption is a problem. So that is an issue that is requiring attention. So anything that requires attention, that's part of where we begin setting the agenda. And agenda setting is concerned with the way problems emerge as candidates for government attention. So we have all these problems that we have as a country, from education to trade to commerce to health to engineering to education, all that. So what requires government attention is what forms part of the agenda. And agenda setting therefore means that we need to start talking about it and we need to take action around it. If we don't set the agenda, there is no way we can actually form the policies. So government is always faced with time constraints and resource constraints. So government cannot do everything at the same time. So we don't have all the money that are needed. We don't have all the time to solve all the problems. So you have to define what is it that will get into government agenda. So for public problems to attract government action, they must form part of the agenda of the government. So we have been complaining that maybe certain things are not being done in the country, but so long as a problem has not formed part of government agenda, it cannot act on them. So there are two types of agendas for government: systemic agendas and institutional agendas. So if you are going to look at the first one, the systemic agenda, one refers to social problems in society, which qualify for public discussion and agenda. So these are systemic, meaning they are already there. They exist within our social strata. So it's poverty, is it underage pregnancies, it's FGM, it is insecurity, it is high dropout rate for kids. So it's already existing in our system. But there are no solutions already that have existed, or we are brainstorming and thinking through. So that's called systemic agenda, meaning it is embedded in our society. It's there. So what do we need to do about it? We have a problem, like car crashes or road accidents. There are many. So what exactly do we need to do about that? So that is a systemic agenda. it's already a problem that is there, or poverty, or lack of housing. But institutional agenda are the problems that are being considered already by the policymakers. So it is the action that that government is already considering to solve. So when you go to NEMA, you can ask them, what exactly are you looking at in an environment? So they'll tell you that actually for us, we are worried about maybe plastic bags, or people are not segregating waste, people are dumping waste out there. So it's already an institutional setup. The government body is already conversing and thinking through that particular problem. That's different from systemic, that is already embedded within the society. So when you're looking at setting at the agenda, you focus on what is the challenge around the society, embedded problems, we don't have solutions, but something should be done about it, or what is it that the government bodies are looking at or should be looking at from an institutional perspective. Then lastly, when you're setting the agenda, we have different approaches that we look at. One, you can look at it from a process perspective. How do we define that particular problem? Who defines the problem? Do we define it as the non-state actors, or do we wait for the government to define it? So that is how we look at it. Number two is the power distribution. So who has the power to take action? Is it parliament? Is it executive? Is it the president? Is it the cabinet secretary? Is it institution like NEMA? Is it ministry and the rest? So it's the power distribution. Who is responsible for setting the pace in terms of the power? Institution-based, which institution is responsible for setting the agenda? And lastly, the contingency. So contingency perspective helps us to see issues that we have not planned about. Like now, goons have become a challenge in our political process. It's a contingency. So people need to take a policy action now as we talk, because it has just emerged. Or you can have flooding. We require a policy on flood control and mitigation. We had not planned about it, it's a contingency. So again, those are the different approaches that we can take when you're looking at setting the agenda. Then the other second last part is policy formulation. So here we are looking at how do we formulate the policies. We have set the agenda. We've all agreed that we need to do something around high dropout rates in secondary schools. So it's a process of generating and selecting options. What are the options that we need to do to solve that particular public problem? Do we then send the parents to jail if kids don't go to school? Do we send the kids to jail if they don't go to school? Do we give free education? What exactly is causing them not to go to school? Then identification and setting out of the course of action. So what do we need to do? Now, this is where we have a challenge, because you need to do policy analysis, define the problem properly, and then we need to select what is the best, based on the alternative options and the risks that we have, select the best option. Now here, the problem sometimes we make is that we rush into making a policy option or selecting options that perhaps may not deal with the real root cause of the problem. Then here, what you then do is that you pick policy instruments. So once you pick the options and the choices, then you have to select proposals and the instruments that you're going to use. Instruments here, we mean that they could be in the 4 different categories. You could take information-based instruments. This means tools that the government will use to solve a problem. So kids are dropping out of secondary school. So we need to get information-based. This means education, public awareness, creation, promotion, media campaigns. So we need to have a media campaign. We need to have a awareness creation to parents and children that education is important. You see here, you're not providing any money. You're just setting instruments and measures to just provide information to people, or like HIV and AIDS, just provide information to the people. Or you can have authority-based. This is where you regulate. Then you say, any parent who is not taking their children to school, then you commit an offense. Or any person who is driving beyond a particular speed, you commit an offense. So that is authority-based. You regulate by force. Treasure-based instruments is money. We need to allocate a budget, or we need to tax people, or we need to impose a particular levy. So again, you use treasure-based. And lastly is organizational-based. We need to create a parastatal or a body to regulate this area or to manage. So in short, when you're formulating policies, the instruments or the measures that you take, they fall within these 4 categories. You can either provide information, you can either regulate by force, you can either provide money, or whether it's taxation or budget, or you set up organizations, or even reform those organizations. So these are the different pathways that you can take when you're formulating policies. Then in terms of the different instruments that the process that we take for formulating sessional papers and legislative instruments, briefly, you have to define the problem. So ministries, departments, agencies have to define the problems. And we as non-state actors participate in defining those problems. That's where it begins. Then you set the agenda. The ministries again set the agenda, and we work towards setting the agenda. There are technical committees that are set up, which include non-state actors, to develop those frameworks. Whether you're developing a bill or you're developing the policy, you do your research, draft, consult the stakeholders, meet the threshold in terms of public participation, have the cabinet or county assembly approving those instruments, and then parliament to legislate if it's a bill, county assembly to legislate or to approve if it's a session of people. So the last part then I can pose for questions. Briefly, for the procedure for formulating bills or statutes, for those who are perhaps may not be familiar with the process, I just run through briefly. So most bills are after you finalize on the bill, whether it's within the ministry or within a county assembly. Normally, you give it to the AG or the Attorney General to review and approve, and to do the final drafting. The cabinet would approve that. And then, of course, review, consider that, look at all the criteria, whether it meets the threshold for legislation, then they proceed with enactment. Now, but in terms of parliament, the government bills are sponsored by the chairpersons of the committees. But also, individual members of parliament or county assembly may sponsor a bill. And I've been involved in both ways, where working with bills sponsored by government or working on bills sponsored by individual legislators. And so for you need to think through, sometimes you could be participating on a bill to work with an individual member. We call them private members' bills. Then of course, it creates an approach for us to work with private individuals, individual members of parliament or county assembly to propose bills. But when a bill is introduced in the National Assembly, but it relates to counties, it has to go to the Senate for legislation. Then we have brief procedures. If it's a bill sponsored by an individual member, it goes through pre-publication scrutiny. This is where the committee scrutinizes the bill, requests for comments from the mother ministry and also the Attorney General, just to confirm that the bill is critical. They confirm whether it's a money bill, so it has to go to the budget committee. So that is a whole process. Then you publish the bill. It goes through first reading, just tabling. Then it starts the process of legislation, committed to the committee. So the committee will review the bill, hold stakeholder engagement, seek views, and this is where we have to always provide for input during the committee stage, because this is where the committee can hear us, take our views, and of course, the committee prepares its report and submits that report to the assembly. Then, of course, there's second reading where the bill is it's moved by the sponsor. There's a debate. Members of parliament or assembly just discuss. Do I like it? Don't I like it? What do I like it about the bill? But you don't amend the bill at all. But then after that, you go to the committee of the whole house. So this is where now you go clause by clause, amending, either approving or amending that particular step. So this is again a space where non-state actors can influence, because then you do propose specific amendments that legislators can run with. Then there's that reading where again there's still space for adoption and amendments. Then of course presidential assent or the governor, and then publishing. So that's just a basic summary of the process of enacting the bill. But for the statutory instruments, we have the Statutory Instruments Act, that is the regulations, rules, orders, guidelines. So they are not enacted like the Act. The ministry or executive prepares the instruments, they gazette them, and then of course they are tabled to the assembly, and reviewed by the Committee on Delegated Legislation. If they're approved, they go through. If they're rejected, then they cease being operational. Again, this is important for us. Our space for engagement mainly is during the preparation of those instruments, and also when the assembly requests for few views and feedback from the people. Then finally for certain instruments, I think I just highlighted that in terms of the process and the value for that oversight. But Statutory Instruments Act requires that you must engage the public, and the stakeholders will be affected by that particular instrument. Then lastly, how do we reform policies? Why I thought this is important is because it's not the space around the just aligned area, but we reform policies in a wider way. So policy reforms are a part of policy process, but they require a restructuring and a complete overhaul of a particular policy space. So political leadership, as part of their campaign manifestos or commitments during campaigns, they can drive policy shift. For example, when the late President Kibaki came into power, he had promised earlier that there will be free primary education. So in 2003, we had a complete reform in education sector. So that was a complete overhaul in education reform. So we have to look at political agendas to advance the reform agenda. So the reforms could come in whether public procurement, taxation, and all that. But also they can be initiated by government during the ordinary course of public service, or they can be initiated by the political leadership. So even staff themselves, the ordinary public servants, they can initiate the policy process, and that again works pretty well. And then lastly, non-state actors can shape the agenda of policy reforms. So when you look at institutions like the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights, the Independent Oversight Police Authority, those are bodies that were spearheaded by the reform agenda from the non-state actors. So you can see for reforms, it's not just a process, it is actually an overhaul of a complete setup. So thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. It's just within the time. So back to you, Dennis. We can have maybe question and answers and the reflections. So thank you so much.
If today's conversation sparked a thought, shifted your perspective, or started a question, don't keep it to yourself. Share this episode, like, subscribe, leave us a comment, and join the conversation online. You can find us at beneath.the.impact on all socials. Until next time, stay curious, stay grounded, and keep digging beneath the impact.